gothic enough, mad enough, even for you. It doesn't make sense, Sherlock.
The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes is the defining series of detective fiction for many in the world, and with good reason. Arthur Conan Doyle took the blueprint laid down by Edgar Allan Poe and expanded it to such a degree that when he tried stopping writing about Sherlock, 20,000 people canceled their Strand Magazine subscriptions, where his stories were being serialized. Doyle wanted to use Holmes' established reputation to introduce a counterpart so sinister that despite having only one appearance in the original canon run, you would believe he could kill Sherlock without question. In this video, we'll talk about said counterpart and take a look at his entire life to explore what makes Professor Moriarty such an iconic villain, despite originally being slated for a single appearance. So put on your spoiler hats, everyone, because this is gonna be a bumpy ride. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Consulting Criminal, Professor Moriarty's introduction to the Sherlock-verse. In Arthur Conan Doyle's original Sherlock run, which lasted from 1887 to 1893, James Moriarty makes a single appearance. Well, two if you count his brother Colonel James Moriarty. And we do think the fact that they both share the same name was some kind of mix-up. But you know, we shall trudge along anyway. In The Adventure of the Final Problem, Sherlock Holmes shows up at John Watson's doorstep one night, with no explanation and no prior notice. Holmes has been in France during this time, attending to matters for the French governing class, and he'd only sent Watson 2 letters in about as many years. So Watson was taken aback to say the least by his friend's sudden appearance, and even more so when he started bolting his shutters and securing his door. Holmes was pale, and his knuckles suggested he'd just fought someone off. Watson had never seen his friend this afraid or on edge, and when he asked if he'd ever heard of Professor Moriarty, he expressed his ignorance. Holmes wasn't surprised, because that was the way of the Napoleon of crime. After making sure that no one was listening in on their conversation, Holmes explains that every case they've been involved in since the study in Scarlet has somehow had Moriarty's hand in it. In his time as a detective, Holmes had come across many such cases where criminals were being shielded by an invisible hand, but he couldn't make the connection until recently, when Moriarty made a rare error. That was enough for Holmes to gather evidence that would get both him and his cabal arrested for a long time. But of course, Moriarty had caught on to his machinations. Holmes describes a series of seemingly unrelated events that occurred on his way to Watson's home that prove just how far Moriarty's reach goes. He was nearly run over by a speeding wagon, and then a brick nearly fell on his head from a house whose roof was being renovated. Both of those things could have been chalked up to accidents, which exemplified Moriarty's hidden influence. He's not some brutish industrial age warlord, he's a spider, who sits in the center of his web, never moving, but ever cognizant of the radiations of each individual strand that he shoots out. Moriarty can place his agents anywhere, anytime, and to prove that, his third attempt on Holmes' life involved him sending a street brute to assault him. That's why Holmes looked so disheveled, and to his benefit, Watson was willing and able to flee with him across the country. He gave him elaborate directions to get his luggage to Victoria and himself to Strand, where he was to board a brougham that would take him to the railway station separately. But even then, Moriarty had managed to catch up to them. Watson didn't recall Holmes when he showed up in his Italian priest disguise, but he could pretty much gather how their opponent looked like when Holmes pointed him out running at the station, trying to get their train flagged. They try to throw off every trail Moriarty puts on them and reach Switzerland by way of Canterbury and Brussels. But alas, the professor wouldn't be much of a genius if he couldn't outwit Sherlock in such things. The only time Moriarty gets speaking time in Doyle's work is when Holmes recounts a surprise visit from him at Baker Street, which is the epitome of demure deviance. Moriarty is quiet, courteous, and observes his manners when addressing his arch-nemesis, but he never lets go of his aura of danger. He concedes that he had enjoyed their little intellectual game long enough, but Holmes' work dismantling his empire now threatened to expose him. Moriarty had protected himself so well up to this point that if anyone had called him a criminal in public, they would be fined a year's salary for breaching libel laws. However, Holmes had definitive proof of his connection to the underworld, which meant that by Monday, all that protection would disappear in a puff of smoke. Moriarty was aware of Holmes' ploy to get him arrested, and the fact that he couldn't do anything about it thanks to Mycroft, but that doesn't mean he was about to lie down and admit defeat. He warned Holmes that if he didn't drop his plans from coming to fruition, neither would Moriarty. And when Scotland Yard came for his men, the professor escaped. Holmes received word of this while he was in transit, and it frustrated him to no end. He knew that you could only take out a spider by crushing its head, but Moriarty was still alive and likely on the run. Holmes was aware that sooner or later he would come to kill him, so staying alive until the hearing where he needed to testify was crucial. He thought that by removing himself to the village of Meiringen, Switzerland, he'd be staying out of sight, and thereby out of Moriarty's mind. But when he met a random Swiss gentleman requesting medical aid near the Reichenbach Falls, he knew that he'd been had from the beginning. Watson, being a man of medicine, couldn't refuse the Swiss youth's distress call, and rushed back to the inn where he and Holmes had been taking shelter. By the time he figured out it was all a ruse, it was too late. As he rushed back to where he had left his best friend, Watson saw glimpses of a silhouette climbing the falls like a panther. By the time he got there was no trace of him or Sherlock, save for the latter's cane and silver cigarette case, within which was a letter. Holmes told his friend how he knew the Swiss was deceiving them, so Moriarty could isolate Sherlock, but he let it happen because he didn't want to put Watson in danger. Even in a message regarding his death, Holmes was thorough enough to put down the exact details that the police would need to finalize their case against Moriarty. From the evidence present on the scene, it seemed as though the two men walked to the edge of the cliff and then disappeared. There were no returning tracks. But it was clear that Sherlock and Moriarty scuffled with one another, seeing as the ground was all busted up, and the tree branches were bent and broken. The only logical conclusion was that in their struggle, both men fell over the edge, and the rocks and rushing waters of Rheinbach Falls took them both out. John Watson lived with that reality for a fair few months. Doyle's readers lived with it for close to a decade, because originally, he planned on sticking to this as the canon ending of Sherlock Holmes. The final lines of The Final Problem, Watson felt compelled to make a clear statement with regards to his best friend's career, due to those injudicious champions who endeavored to clear his memory by attacking his reputation and furthering Moriarty's propaganda. Watson wrote that he shall ever regard Sherlock Holmes as the best and wisest man he'd ever known, and in saying that, he was correct. Though the world's only consulting detective was a man of several eccentricities and a serious drug problem, he never sought to project his issues or impose them upon another person. He dealt with them, and worked towards justice even through the haze of narcotic usage, until the bitter end. The fact that Moriarty still had people defending him in the public eye, and that Watson had to write what is basically a defense in support of his friend, just goes to show you how far his spiderweb reached. Arthur wanted to move on from Holmes and focus on historical fiction projects instead, but in an unprecedented audience-led movement, he was compelled to bring him back. This must have been one of the earliest instances of an author being forced to continue a series he was done and dusted with, but at least the quality of Doyle's work never dipped. He brought Sherlock back with the Hounds of Baskerville sequel, and then properly resurrected him in The Adventure of the Empty House. From that point onward, the influence of Moriarty on his life was mentioned right up until his last bow. The Professor played an indirect role in the 1914 prequel novel Valley of Fear, which featured a disguised American detective as its murder suspect. This novel sort of retconned what Doyle had said about Moriarty in The Final Problem, because there, Watson was completely unaware of the Napoleon of crime. In Valley, Watson knows enough about Moriarty to crack a joke about his existence that's so good it gets a compliment from Holmes. So we guess Doyle sort of forgot this was a prequel. Keeping that aside, the scope of his spider's web can be felt at the beginning and end of Valley of Fear. The novel begins with Holmes getting an encrypted message from one of his associates, Fred Porlock, which foretells an assassination attempt on the life of one Douglas. Sure enough, Inspector MacDonald arrives soon after the message to deliver the news that Barker is dead, and this stirs him into action. Valley of Fear is where he begins gathering evidence for his operation against Moriarty's cabal, and his first act is to set MacDonald onto the good professor. He's been to Moriarty's office before, so all Holmes had to do was plant the seed of doubt in his mind, which he knew no doubt would germinate sooner rather than later. When he visited Moriarty's office, MacDonald saw an original painting from Jean-Baptiste Greuze, which, Holmes pointed out, would have been impossible for him to purchase on his annual salary of £700, unless he had some other way of making money. By this point, we knew that that was him acting as a consulting criminal and a facilitator of crimes of sorts. Moriarty had under his iron fist a bunch of assassins, intimidators, and criminals of the worst sort, who reinforced the terms of his agreement with his contractors in no uncertain terms. After tipping Holmes off to Douglas' plight, Porlock sent him another message telling him to burn the cipher because he knew Moriarty was onto him, and if he was caught corresponding with the enemy, he'd be given the death sentence. At first, it looked like the professor had succeeded in his goal of killing Douglas, but Holmes' persistence revealed the man was actually alive, and his real name was Bertie Edwards. 5 years ago, he busted a major criminal organization in Vermissa Valley, but because of his exploits, the gang of murderers had put a hit out on him. He escaped to England and assumed a new identity, even found a new love, but his old life caught up with him. One of his former acquaintances arrived to the Isles looking to kill Douglas, so Douglas killed him and with the help of a friend, disguised the man as himself. When Sherlock discovered that he was alive, he told Douglas to escape England as soon as possible, because if he'd figured this out, then Moriarty couldn't be far behind him. Turns out he was right, because Douglas was thrown overboard from the ship he was going to escape on, and despite many calling it an accident, Holmes knew it was cold murder. This led to the final problem, after which Moriarty's name was invoked thrice in comparison to other characters. Once when Holmes recounted the tale of his survival to Watson, and once out of sheer boredom. In The Adventure of the Empty House, 3 years have passed since Holmes' presumed death, and Watson finds himself unable to let go of the allure of working cases. He comes across a most peculiar one in the form of the death of a Mr. Adair, who was murdered in a locked room with no conceivable exit. When Watson arrived at the scene of the crime, he bumped into an old man carrying books, and helped him pick his books up before making his initial assessment of the place. But when he reached home, he'd learned that the old man had followed him, and after a quick routine of "What's that behind you?" Sherlock revealed himself. Watson's shock gave way to joy a bit too quickly, as was typical of the short stories of this time, because the more important topic was how Sherlock survived. Watson was sure that he and Moriarty struggled at the falls and fell to their deaths, and he was only half right about that. Turns out, after giving Holmes enough time to write that note, Moriarty rushed him, intending to kill them both, now that the jig was up. Holmes anticipated this, and used the Baritsu wrestling maneuver to send the professor careening over the ledge. Fun fact, Doyle calls Baritsu a Japan form of wrestling, but it's actually a mixed martial art discipline created by an Englishman, Edward William Barton Wright. After a 3-year journey through Japan, Edward returned to the Isles and devised the discipline for gentlemanly self-defense that involved elements of boxing, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, fencing, and cane fighting. Umbrellas became lethal weapons in the hands of one of his students, and Edward's school of martial arts was called Bartitsu, not Baritsu. But anyway, thanks to this form of self-defense and Holmes' familiarity with it, he was able to execute the sidestep of the century and send Professor Moriarty to his death. This presented him with the unique opportunity to fake his own demise and pursue the remnants of his organization from the shadows. Before he knew it, Holmes was climbing the side of a falls that appeared too steep to scale, but actually had enough cutouts that one could climb it with difficulty. Holmes was doing just that, but his efforts were being scuppered by one of his remaining targets, Moriarty's lieutenant, Colonel Sebastian Moran. Apparently, Moran had dropped Moriarty off at Reichenbach and managed to elude capture for the past 3 years that Holmes had been dead. He tried killing him immediately after his leader's demise, but Sherlock was able to outwit and outlast him with a bit of luck. He returned to London upon hearing the news of the Adair case, because he figured it would lead him to his target, or rather his target to him. Turns out he was right, because the Colonel tried to assassinate Sherlock at his old home in Baker Street. Luckily, he was prepared for that, and he left a wax dummy in his likeness back at the place, which he'd have Mrs. Hudson move around quite frequently to give the impression that he'd come home. Once Scotland Yard apprehended the Colonel in the act, and retrieved his novelty air rifle, which was likely designed by Moriarty, Sherlock officially announced his return to the world and went right back to solving crimes with his buddy. In The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, Holmes laments the fact that London has become particularly uninteresting since Moriarty's passing, and right on cue, an interesting case falls in his lap. A young solicitor called John McFarlane bursts into his office and begs him for help because he suspects that he was about to be arrested for the murder of a builder from Lower Norwood called Jonas Oldacre. Turns out, this Jonas person showed up out of nowhere one day and promised John his inheritance, before he disappeared from the house they were living at in such a way that John could have been the only suspect in the murder. Oldacre's plot to frame John and his family was based on a vendetta with his mother, because she rejected him a few years back, and now he wanted revenge. He was doing well at keeping Sherlock interested, until he tried faking evidence to get ahead of the game. Holmes had done a sweep of the scene of the crime and found no bloody fingerprint, but when the case seemed to be swaying in favor of John's defense, the fingerprint magically appeared, tying him to Oldacre's death. Sherlock burnt the house down to prove that he was still alive, because no rat wants to stink in the ship they've made, and that was that. The 3 times he compared one of his adversaries to Moriarty were in The Illustrious Client, The Mysterious Three-Quarter, and The Last Bow, and to be honest, it only applies to one of them. In The Mysterious Three-Quarter, Sherlock investigates the disappearance of Cambridge rugby team's star three-quarter, Godfrey Staunton. The team captain asks for his help because Godfrey disappeared the night before a big game, and his uncle, Lord Mont James, wasn't being very helpful. Sherlock took the case and visited the hotel that the boys were staying at. Then the post office, where he uses his classic misdirection to pilfer information about Godfrey's movements. He ends up meeting Dr. Leslie Armstrong, whose confrontational nature and suspicion that Holmes had been hired by Godfrey's uncle make him immediately wary of the pair. Armstrong's cold treatment of him and precise yet assertive demeanor reminded Holmes of Moriarty a lot, but this man turned out to be a lot better as a person at the end of the day. The reason Armstrong was being rude to Sherlock and Watson wasn't because he'd caused Godfrey's disappearance. It was because he was concealing the fact. Godfrey comes from a rich family, which you might have guessed by his uncle's title, but he ended up marrying a common girl, which created a rift between them. Godfrey was playing rugby as an arrangement, which compelled him to be there for the game no matter what happened to his wife. But when she contracted consumption and was at death's door, he couldn't just sit by and let her pass. He rushed back home, but by the time he arrived, it was too late. Leslie only wished for him to grieve in peace, and when he learned that Holmes wasn't hired by Mount James, he gladly spilled the beans to him so he could help them out. Armstrong turned out to be more ally than enemy, but the last two men on this list were definite villains. Baron Adalbert Gruner from The Illustrious Client and von Bork from The Last Bow were the only targets of Sherlock Holmes' investigations to reach the level of Moriarty. In The Illustrious Client, Sherlock is hired by the mystery titular client to break up the impending marriage of Baron Adalbert Gruner and Lady Violet de Merville. Gruner is an extremely attractive, intelligent, and debauched man. He has used his status and his mind to find his way into the chambers of many a woman, and left them disfigured, or, in the case of his ex-wife, dead. Holmes is actually shocked by how charming he can be in person, because when he went to measure the guy up, he not only responded calmly, but was confident that his manipulation of Violet would never break. He had used his dulcet tones and luscious locks to implant post-hypnotic suggestion within her mind that would make her reject anything negative she heard about him as rumor and propaganda. In her eyes, he was a man wrongfully accused, and so completely did she believe this lie that even when she was presented with proof of his actions, she stood fast. Sherlock used one of his underworld contacts, Shinwell Johnson, to unearth the existence of Gruner's previous mistress, a Miss Kitty Winters. One look at her would tell you that someone had beaten her up and abused her like a cur, and Kitty was more than willing to point her finger at Gruner. Holmes took her with him when he confronted Violet, but was forced to retreat when her stone-faced refusal of all his accusations sent Kitty flying into a rage. He knew that Gruner was as worthy an opponent as Moriarty, and hatched a scheme to get the only other thing that could prove his guilt, his trophy book. Being a true pervert, the Baron was not content with abusing women. He took pictures of them and wrote detailed accounts of his actions, which he kept in a notebook hidden in his study. Kitty was aware of this notebook's existence, and Sherlock needed to retrieve it. But he was beaten up pretty bad by some of the Baron's agents. Instead of taking a step back from this dangerous man, Holmes instead spread rumors about his impending death through the papers, and told Watson to learn everything he could about Chinese pottery. He then hatched his plan, which involved Watson posing as a fine china connoisseur to create the window Sherlock needed to secure the notebook. He knew that Watson could not keep up the ruse for too long, but Kitty had told him where the Baron kept the book in his old home, and creatures of habit were sure to keep up their habits no matter their current environment. Sure enough, he found it in the study, and his gateway was secured by Kitty herself, who took her revenge by throwing sulfuric acid in Gruner's face. Watson saved his life, but the beauty he'd used to deceive women with was gone. And so was his hold over Violet, once she read the contents of his conquest journal. At the end of the story, it's implied that Sherlock was hired by King Edward VII, who wanted to prevent a royal scandal at any cost, so he lent Sherlock a piece from his own china collection to deceive Gruner. In The Last Bow, Holmes appears first as the Irish-American Altamont, who's working for a German spy called von Bork during World War I. The story begins with a meeting between Bork and another covert German operative, Baron von Herling. The latter has arrived at the former's home just as Germany prepares a major offensive against the English. Von Bork has been using his cover as an alcohol daredevil sportsman who's down for all sorts of fun to get in with Britain's high society and pilfer important national documents. For 4 years, he'd been developing a network of spies and informants, and has several papers crucial to the defense of the United Kingdom. Von Herling was already impressed with how effectively von Bork had maintained his cover, even against the soft Englishmen, whose steel is buried underneath their velvets. But Bork dismisses his concerns because he has an excellent agent, which could make or break the German invasion. The English Channel posed the biggest threat to their operation, thanks to the strength of the Royal Navy. Von Bork had detailed records on how the English were preparing the fords, harbor defenses, and aeroplanes for the war effort. He knew their plans for Rosyth, Ireland, Egypt, Portsmouth forts, the Channel, and a dozen other strategic locations. All in all, he'd gathered information on close to a couple dozen key national security issues, and with Altamont's scheduled delivery, he'd be in a position to allow Germany to take over the English coastline within a week. Sadly for him, Altamont turned out to be Sherlock Holmes, who came out of retirement for this mission. Von Bork's sabotage of the English counteroffense had been so effective that the government were forced to seek Holmes' assistance. For the past few months, he'd been working as Altamont, feeding Bork false information right right up until the opportune moment presented itself. Once his family was safely out of the way, Holmes, who had been using Bork's housekeeper Martha as an informant, used the chance to reveal himself and chloroform the target of his investigation. He then explained how much of a risk Bork was to Watson, as his machinations had already cost them dearly in the war effort. When the spy came back to his senses, he vowed to revenge himself upon Holmes, and that's when Sherlock broke into a characteristically attitudinal retort. He told Bork he could try, but he'd fail like Colonel Moran and Moriarty before him. He revealed his true identity to Bork, and his reputation was enough to drive the fight out of the spy. This was one of the last Sherlock Holmes stories in the canon's chronology, because you never really hear of him coming out of retirement after this. And it speaks volumes of Moriarty's legacy, seeing as Holmes was referring to him over 2 decades after his demise. It's clear that Arthur Conan Doyle knew he'd given his main character a worthy adversary in the same story where he'd killed said adversary off, and so the name Moriarty became immortalized in Sherlock canon. These days, it's easy to forget that he was part of only 2 stories from the overall 62 that Doyle penned with his own hands, because Moriarty is the quintessential Sherlock villain. Every genius needs a foil just as good as him to keep the story going, and that's the approach most filmmakers and playwrights took when they adapted Doyle's most recognizable work for the screen and stage. One of the earliest Sherlock Holmes plays, which debuted in 1899, featured its playwright in the lead role. Sir Arthur had penned a script for a potential theater act based on his character in 1897, but when it landed in the hands of William Gillette, he might as well have rewritten the whole story. The end result was Sherlock Holmes, The Curious Case of Miss Faulkner, the first instance of Holmesian lore being subject to pastiche. In this play, William L. Abington played Professor Moriarty, and his name was actually Robert, seeing as the Napoleon of crime had not been given a forename at this point in his life. William Gillette also introduced new elements, like giving Holmes a love interest, which Doyle was initially opposed to, but couldn't help being charmed by once he saw the play himself. This marked the beginning of a run of Sherlock theater dramas that continue to this day. In 1912, the twins Andres Bjornson and Bjarne Bjornson played the role of Moriarty and Holmes respectively. Perhaps that's where the idea of the professor was basically Sherlock's evil twin took root. But discussing stage adaptations is not as simple as discussing film adaptations, because at least then we can show you what we're talking about. So now that we've seen how Sir Arthur enshrined his greatest villain on the page, let's look at Moriarty's establishment as an iconic villain on the reel. Earliest adaptations of Professor Moriarty. One of the earliest depictions of Professor Moriarty on screen came courtesy of Stoll Pictures, who released a series of short films and full-length features depicting Sherlock Holmes' adventures. From 1921 to 1923, A.L. Norwood played the ace detective in nearly 50 projects, but some of them were lost, including his adaptation of The Final Problem. All we know about that film is that Percy Standing played the role of Professor Moriarty in it, and in the year of its release, he also played the role of Stephen Belmont in Alice Ramsey's Fires of Fate, which was an adaptation of Doyle's The Tragedy of the Korosko. This means that one of the earliest surviving depictions of the iconic villain comes from Goldwyn Pictures, whose roaring lion sting is now the heart of the MGM brand. They picked up Gillette's play for a silent film adaptation and cast the legendary John Barrymore in the role of Sherlock Holmes. If that name sounds familiar to you, that's because you know his granddaughter Drew from films like E.T., Scream, Charlie's Angels, 51st Dates, Donnie Darko, and of course, Batman Forever. Released in 1922, John Barrymore's Sherlock closely followed the version created by Gillette, and had a similar backstory and character trajectory. The film begins with Cambridge student Prince Alexis being accused of stealing the college's athletic funds. Alexis is secretly the nephew of Count von Stolberg, so technically there was no need for him to resort to theft. Knowing this fact, he suggested Alexis seek out their college peer Sherlock Holmes, who had a mind for solving puzzles such as this one. Alexis commissioned Holmes to locate the true culprit of the robbery, and he did, a Mr. Foreman Wells. However, upon confronting the man, Holmes learned that he didn't steal the money for personal gain. He was looking to get out of England because he didn't want to get involved with the evil criminal mastermind, Professor Moriarty. Wells' father was a crook who worked for Moriarty, and Wells himself was being groomed for a job he knew would end up causing no good. He wanted to escape before he was forced to commit a crime. But this story only fascinated Holmes. He decided to meet Moriarty personally, and proposed that he observe the criminal mastermind's movements, to better understand what makes criminals tick. But Moriarty refuses him rather curtly, and Holmes tells his college mate Watson that stopping him was now his life's mission. A few years pass, and Sherlock has become a master detective, recognized by the public and his peers. But there's one mystery he couldn't solve, that of his college sweetheart's disappearance. One day, while he was out sharpening his observational skills, Holmes fell from his vantage point, hit his head, and knocked himself unconscious. He was nursed back to health by a woman called Alice Faulkner, who was also the subject of Gillette's play. Sherlock had solved many crimes since the day she saved him, but he could never find her. That was until he was given a lead on her location through a case. Count von Stolberg, who was now the crown prince, had once promised to marry Alice's sister Rose Faulkner, but then his brothers died and he had to assume the throne, making that impossible. Rose committed suicide, but Alice kept her sister's love letters as a memento to her memory. Moriarty, wanting to blackmail the new crown prince, put Alice under the employ of one of his underlings. He was close to getting those letters when Sherlock interfered and exposed him. He decided to take Alice hostage instead, and Holmes saved her as well. The ending of the film was a combination of the final problem and the adventure of the empty house. Holmes reunited with his beloved Alice, who was using the Scotland Yard friend's assistance to hide in a safe house, seeing as Moriarty's entire organization was now after him. He was aware that the professor had his agents aiming rifles at his safe house, and Alice nearly got them killed when she lifted the blinds. But Holmes was 3 steps ahead. When it became evident that long-distance methods wouldn't work against him, Moriarty arrived to kill Holmes himself. But unlike the final problem, Sherlock had a full audience to attend to his apprehension of the greatest criminal in Britain. The movie ends with a feel-good moment, as Sherlock and Alice ride off into the sunset to get married to each other. You can tell this was an early 20th century film, thanks to the unnecessary love angle, but the few minutes that Moriarty received in it were absolutely phenomenal. The Napoleon of crime was played by legendary actor Gustav von Seyffertitz, who was the quintessential bad guy of that era of cinema. He had over 100 film credits under his belt by the time he passed away in the early 1940s, and his look as Moriarty from this film has been reproduced over and over again for the generic evil old bad man. He's gaunt like Doyle described his character, but his square protruding jaw makes him seem decidedly evil. Gustav's Moriarty also clearly had makeup work done, because he was supposed to be an 80-year-old man. But the disheveled, crusty appearance that was a result of practical effects of the time ended up feeling iconic. The final scene of this movie made Moriarty's end slightly comical, with the way in which he's discovered and exposed becoming the classic comedy trope of stopping disguised trespassers. But it also kicked off a spree of Sherlock Holmes movies that kept moving away from the source material. The world's greatest detective was given a voice on screen in 1929, when Clive Brooke portrayed him in The Return of Sherlock Holmes. This story is loosely based on the collection of stories of the same name, but features Moriarty as the lead antagonist, a la Valley of Fear. The professor was portrayed by veteran stage actor Harry T. Morey, and his motivation in this movie was quite similar to Moriarty's goal from The Valley of Fear. Set quite a ways into the future, the daughter of Holmes' dear friend Watson is engaged to a man who used to work for Moriarty. This man has documents that can incriminate his former employer, and is surely marked for death. The climax of the story takes place on a cruise liner, where Holmes adopts multiple disguises to thwart Moriarty's plan of killing Longmore. And the reason this film is so significant to the canon is that the first time you hear the line, "Elementary, my dear Watson," Brooke reprised the role twice in as many years, but his films were overshadowed by several competitors. Ernest Torrance replaced Morey as Moriarty in the last film, but no one remembers his performance quite as fondly as the others. The 30s saw a massive boom in the Holmesian film industry. In 1931, 2 major Sherlock Holmes movies came out. One was led by Raymond Massey, and the other by Arthur Wantner. Massey's film was an adaptation of The Speckled Band, a story that saw Holmes solve a murder by deciphering the kind of snake the murderer had used. Wantner's was an adaptation of The Sleeping Cardinal. The latter gained more fanfare than the former due to Massey's slow, withdrawn performance. But to be fair to him, Hollywood was extremely ageist at the time. Wantner was around the same age as Massey, yet he got to be the star of the series of 5 Holmes films produced by Twickenham Studios, a version of which still exists today. The Sleeping Cardinal combined the final problem and the empty house once more, but made Adair's death a consequence of him stepping out of line. Norman MacKinnell played Moriarty in The Sleeping Cardinal, but in the last 2 Wantner movies he was replaced by Lynn Harding, who had previously played Dr. Grimesby Roylott opposite Raymond Massey's Sherlock Holmes. He wasn't the only actor from the Holmes-verse to play another character before becoming someone else. Reginald Owen was the Watson to Clive Brooks Sherlock, but in 1933, he became Holmes himself. His consulting detective was set in the contemporary age, and his Watson was more butler than doctor and best friend. The results were so disastrous that he was never cast in the role again, and the best review for the film called it moderately amusing. Harding's Moriarty was more mob boss than cutthroat genius in a way. He was introduced in The Triumph of Sherlock Holmes, which depicted the events of Valley of Fear as closely as possible, with one major change. Instead of taking place before Moriarty's death, it takes place after Sherlock Holmes' retirement, which is why Moriarty is prominently featured in the film. The opening scene shows him sauntering into 21 Baker Street and congratulating Sherlock for making the wise decision to retire instead of dying by his hand. Holmes takes Mrs. Hudson and retires to Sussex Downs, where he starts beekeeping like he does in Doyle's work. But of course, by now, you know what the Valley of Fear was all about. Soon enough, A message arrives from Porlock, and so begins the hunt for Douglas and the struggle to protect him from the Scourers. Triumph of Sherlock Holmes depicts things in a rather linear fashion, unlike the original story where many things are filled in via flashbacks. But what it does really well is how it handles Moriarty. Lynn Harding's stockier, slightly hunched over build is not at all the athletic old man we're introduced to by Doyle. But he works better as a villain because he's more menacing. He's realistic for his age, and that ending scene in the tower where Holmes shoots him is damn near perfect. It's too bad that the studio had to go and ruin what was mostly a faithful adaptation of the source material by merging the adventure of Silver Blaze with characters from the Hounds of Baskerville in their next film, because it minimized the impact that Harding's Moriarty had on us as viewers. That's not even mentioning the fact that he wasn't even the last one to portray the guy before World War II's conclusion. Professor Moriarty appeared thrice in Basil Rathbone's 14th film stretch as Sherlock Holmes, and all those appearances can be considered original screenplays. In 1939's Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, another one of Hollywood's great villains, George Zucco, took up the mantle of his greatest enemy. The movie begins with Holmes begrudgingly complimenting Moriarty's mind, seeing as the professor had just been acquitted of yet another crime on yet another technicality. He says, "You have a magnificent brain, Moriarty. I admire it so much I'd like to present it pickled in alcohol to the London Medical Society." To which Moriarty replies, "It would make an impressive exhibit," and gets to stepping. This sets the tone for their rivalry, which is revisited twice by Rathbone. But let us finish up with this one first. After this encounter with Moriarty, Holmes is with Watson at Baker Street when he's visited by a Miss Anne Brandon. Turns out, her brother has received a death signal, and they're in a race against time to save his life. In the end, it's revealed that it was all a ruse for Moriarty's real plan, which was stealing the crown jewels of the British Empire. Holmes somehow manages to thwart his plans, corner him, and make him fall to his death. But he always comes back in some inexplicable fashion, and his second appearance takes place during World War II, so you know Allied propaganda had to play a role in it. In Sherlock Holmes: The Secret Weapon, Lionel Atwill replaces George Zucco as Moriarty. Atwill was slated to play the role originally anyway, so his casting was seen as revenge by many fans. Regardless, despite being labeled as an adaptation of The Adventure of the Dancing Men, The Secret Weapon had nothing in common with it, save the use of a clever cipher. Moriarty is working for the Germans, and has kidnapped a scientist capable of building an atomic bomb. But the scientist was a step ahead of him, and used a cipher to protect the secret of how to assemble it. In the end, Sherlock was able to use his patented ingenuity to protect Britain from a nuclear strike, but Moriarty was depicted as being a bit of a lucky bastard in this film. The same cipher Holmes deciphered with his wits, Moriarty deciphered through luck, and at the end of the film, he dies once again, falling 60 feet from a hidden trapdoor that should have definitely crushed his body. But no, he returns in The Woman in Green, this time being portrayed by Henry Daniell, and part of perhaps the most harebrained plotline that we've ever heard. In this film, Moriarty was using post-hypnotic suggestion to make rich men believe that they were cutting off the forefingers of women before killing them, so he could blackmail them for their money. In truth, Moriarty was the one conducting the murders, and he was sure no one would catch up to him, because the victims believed his implanted suggestions so completely. One of the victims' daughters showed up to Baker Street because she caught her dad burying the forefinger, but before Holmes could save the man, he'd been murdered. He remarked that this had the stink of Moriarty all over it, but that wasn't possible because he'd been executed in Montevideo a while back. The Woman in Green is a loose adaptation of The Empty House, so of course there's a scene where a man with a rifle tries to kill Holmes, but this man has been hypnotized by Moriarty as well, as opposed to being the free-willed Colonel Moran from the stories. The Woman in Green ends in much the same way as the other Rathbone movie featuring Moriarty, with him falling to his death, though this time he slips off the roof of a house and clings to a drainpipe desperately, before finally succumbing to gravity. Following the end of World War II and the Rathbone adaptations, the film industry gave the Holmes universe a rest. There were foreign language adaptations of his stories, especially the French one which starred Grégoire Aslan as Moriarty, but no major English language adaptation of Sherlock Holmes was seen before the franchise's revival in the 70s. We know that the musical comedy Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother existed before the 7% Solution. But that movie revolutionized the Holmesian pantheon, after which some form of Sherlock content has always been available to us. Even though it's based on the non-canon work of Nicholas Meyer, it has roots in The Sign of Four, where Doyle makes an offhanded remark that when Sherlock is unoccupied, he occupies himself with cocaine. Back in good old Arthur's time, cocaine was a medical discovery akin to a miracle. It made surgeries a lot less risky and a lot more successful, so it spread through Western society like wildfire. Doyle defended Holmes' habit of using cocaine many times since he wrote quote-unquote sign, but in the end, he had to admit its drastic side effects based on the scientific evidence, and wean Holmes off the drug. The 7% solution is a reference to the dialogue where Holmes asks Watson if he'd like to try his cocaine solution, and the 1976 movie turns it into a major plot point. When you have heavy hitters like Nicole Williamson and Robert Duvall playing Holmes and Watson, you're bound to get an excellent film. But it's Lawrence Oliver's Moriarty that we can't take our eyes off of. He's portrayed exactly how he's described by Doyle, and yet this new addiction angle takes his story in an entirely different direction. It's revealed that Moriarty was the indirect cause of death of Sherlock's mother, which is the root cause for his addictive personality. It's not like he ordered her death or something, but he was having an affair with her, which caused Mr. Holmes to blow her brains out. A young Sherlock figured this out, and ended up thinking Moriarty is a criminal mastermind in a cocaine-induced paranoia episode. He turns out to be correct, of course, though not in the way anyone could have expected. That same year, Fox released a TV film starring Roger Moore as Holmes after his Bond days, and in it, Moriarty was more of a comedy villain. He robbed the International Gold Exchange while constructing a false vault over the real one and making the US government believe they had been robbed while he was robbing them. John Huston did a fantastic job of pulling off what was presented to him, but we're pretty sure most people watched this film for the former Bond. After witnessing the success of 7% Solution, Granada Television went all in on the Holmesverse and created the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes series, starring Jeremy Brett as the titular character. Over the course of 10 years, they adapted 43 of the original 62 stories, and by this point, editing Moriarty into other Sherlock Holmes adventures was rather commonplace. The 7% Solution was just the beginning of the divergence. Eric Porter's Moriarty was involved in an adaptation of The Red-Headed League, where, instead of tunneling underneath a bank, he broke into a museum to try to steal the Mona Lisa. When Holmes stopped that from happening, Moriarty tries to kill him in the events of the final problem, and makes a final appearance in the empty house during Holmes' explanation to Watson with regards to his survival. Archival footage of Porter's Moriarty is used in The Adventure of the Devil's Foot and The Eligible Bachelor, two stories that were completely unrelated to his lore. In this way, Porter established himself as one of the defining Moriartys of the 20th century. Between him, Laurence Olivier, and Paul Freeman's caricature of Moriarty in 1988's Without a Clue, it's evident that the lore of Arthur Conan Doyle could no longer survive intact. Without a Clue is a gem of a film that stars Ben Kingsley as Watson and Michael Caine as Sherlock Holmes. The premise of the film is that Watson is the actual Sherlock Holmes, but he didn't want to expose his true identity to the world, so he created the character of Sherlock Holmes to write about himself through Strand Magazine. His facade catches up to him one day as the public demands to see their hero, so he's forced to hire an actor to play Sherlock's part. The actor is Michael Caine, and between the two of them, some of the moments they manage to conjure within the film are genuine knee-slappers. Paul Freeman's Moriarty performs the bank heist from the Red-Headed League, stealing the printing plates for the £5 currency note. Through a series of comedic errors, Watson and his actor friend end up saving the day, and he announces that they will continue working alongside one another as friends, with the world none the wiser of the truth. Star Trek created a sci-fi version of him, which managed to take over the Enterprise. Data, a fan of Sherlockian literature, ends up becoming a part of one, when a game of detective with LaForge turns into a real-life crisis. LaForge commands the Enterprise's holodeck to create a mystery worthy of being unraveled by Data's advanced mind, and ends up giving life to the Professor instead. Moriarty immediately takes over the ship and demands a real body, and Captain Picard has to trick him into thinking that the Enterprise will help him. This plot is revisited 4 seasons later, when hologram Moriarty makes a return, creates a female version of himself, and runs amok once again. This time, the Enterprise's crew lock him and his missus into a memory drive and disconnect it from all devices, so they can travel the galaxy eternally. And all we have to say about this is, yeah, that happened. Moriarty was also a participant in the wildly popular 80s British TV game show 3-2-1, hosted by Ted Rogers. And at this point, you guys can kinda tell that he'd become a part of the fabric of pop culture, can't you? But you can also probably tell that so many versions of the same character made it stale, which forced media creators to come up with versions that couldn't quite live up to the original. In The Baker Street Boys, Moriarty appears as an irregular villain, playing upon the themes of child labor, as he tries scuppering Sherlock's band of irregulars. In Intrepid Productions' 1993 TV film Sherlock Holmes Returns, the legendary detective, played by Anthony Higgins, wakes up in the 90s and is forced to contend with the descendants of Moriarty, chief among whom is James Moriarty Booth. Such irregular adaptations are why Moriarty needed to be reinvented going into the 20th century, and that's exactly what happens. Andrew Scott and Jared Harris, the 20th century interpretations of Jim Moriarty. The beginning of the 20th century was rough for James. 2003's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen tried blending various classical stories to create a Victorian-era Avengers, but then they had Nick Fury betray the team in the first film, which, to be honest, was only watchable thanks to Sean Connery. When he wasn't being turned into the late Enlightenment Kingpin, James was serving as one of the many antagonists in the fantasy series The Librarians. In Season 2, Moriarty becomes a collaborator of Prospero, the wizard from Shakespeare's Tempest, and works toward empowering him so that he can help create the world Moriarty wants. The Librarians is a show about people assigned to guard important historical and mythical artifacts that most people consider to be fictitious, like the Ark of the Covenant or Indra's Vajra, and Moriarty wants to steal the ones Prospero needed to help give him the chance to murder Shakespeare himself. Ultimately, he ends up turning on his master and helps the Librarians defeat Prospero in what has to be the most bizarre adaptation of the Professor up till that point. In comparison, Vincent D'Onofrio's drug-dealing Moriarty is a much bigger menace. That's right, folks. The notorious Kingpin was Kingpin long before he was Kingpin. And if that sentence gave you a headache, we're sorry. In 2002, the USA Network released a television film titled Sherlock: Case of Evil, which took a new direction towards an old formula. In this film, Sherlock was in his late 20s, far younger than he was in Doyle's work, which makes some of the things he does rather interesting. At the beginning of the film, he's in pursuit of Moriarty, who's a big-time opium dealer. Holmes shoots Moriarty while chasing him through a sewer and thinks that that's the end of the big guy, but as the story unfolds, he realizes he was wrong, and with the help of his new friend Dr. John Watson, an autopsy practitioner, he comes to the conclusion that Moriarty is still alive. This begins a race against time, and the press to pin down the crime boss before he becomes invincible, because Sherlock's use of a weapon made him public enemy number one. It's revealed later on that Moriarty's drug dealing got Mycroft Holmes hooked on opium. And though all of this is far removed from the established canon, all of it just fits within the context of the movie. D'Onofrio practices his mob boss chops with this one, and you can see the telltale signs of Kingpin's emergence are already there. James Darcy's Sherlock is younger, but his deductions are just as sharp, and he manages to turn you around by the end of the film. Richard E. Grant has a spectacular guest role as Mycroft, who takes on Holmes' addiction angle from the 7% Solution storyline. It's an adaptation that many might be put off by because of its American origins, but we think it's worth exploring if you're a Sherlockian yourself. Surprisingly enough, one of the better portrayals of Moriarty comes from the 2013 Russian adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, where he's played by Alexei Gorbanov. Gorbanov's Moriarty is no great professor, nor is he a scientist or aristocratic collaborator. He's a simple cabman who drives his carriage around the town like a model citizen. But in truth, he's a ruthless killer running a gang of murderers whose influence goes to the tippy top. Moriarty is shown in the first couple of episodes as this well-meaning cabman, kept nameless until he's revealed as the man from Watson's old army regiment who's been targeting their former comrades. It's honestly one of the better foreign language adaptations of the Holmes pantheon, and you should seek it out if diverse adaptations are something you're interested in. But considering we're talking about foreign language Moriartys this deep into the video, you can just tell that he's going through a bit of an identity crisis. James' character has been through so many cycles that new creators just didn't know how to portray him, until Guy Ritchie and the BBC gave it a crack. Jared Harris' turn as Moriarty in 1211's Game of Shadows, and Andrew Scott's portrayal of Jim Moriarty from BBC's Sherlock cemented Moriarty as a vessel for anarchy. Harris Moriarty remained faceless in his first Sherlock Holmes film, but his presence was felt keenly through Irene Adler, the only woman that Holmes ever admitted to having bested him. Irene was not his love interest in Doyle's original work. She appeared in A Scandal in Bohemia as the former mistress of a powerful aristocrat who possessed a photo of them from the time of their courtship. Seeing as this nobleman was now married, he wanted to remove any material that could blackmail him from the world, and he commissioned Holmes to track down Irene. He did, but when he learned that the picture was more insurance than blackmail material, he let her go and helped her cover up her escape. Well, that isn't exactly accurate, because Irene outwitted him and traveled out of his reach, but he respected her motives and would fondly remember her as the only woman to match his superior intellect. Watson made it a point to emphasize that Holmes felt no romantic feelings toward Irene, or in fact any woman. But of course, once you've adapted his story so many times over, you need to make small changes to keep things fresh. and making Irene an explicit love interest for Holmes was the only logical conclusion for many of these adapters. This idea was flirted with by many directors before Guy Ritchie, especially in Roger Moore's Sherlock Holmes in New York, where it was implied that Adler's son was fathered by Sherlock. But it was solidified in recent memory by Rachel McAdams' turn as the iconic character, as she portrayed her as a lethal femme fatale. Rachel Adler was more like the Black Cat from the Batman comics. She wasn't afraid of using her sexuality to threaten people's livelihoods, and she was an expert thief. She and Holmes shared a mutual infatuation that Moriarty wanted to exploit in the first film. Using Irene, he sent him on a wild goose chase for Luke Reardon, a deceased occultist whose attempts at merging science with magic had yielded a lethal poison, as well as a prototype radio signal transmitter. Turns out the main attraction of the first film, Lord Blackwood, who was also part of a secretive cabal, was dancing to the strings of the Professor. He'd convinced all of Britain that he was a powerful sorcerer, combining Reardon's devices with theatrics, and was planning to gas the entire House of Parliament so his cabinet could reconquer the United States. That plan failed when Holmes stopped Reardon from pulling the final trigger, as it were, and it forced Moriarty to intervene directly. In a game of shadows, Jared Harris Moriarty makes a scintillating first appearance, where he threatens to and then kills Irene Adler. The opening scene of the movie saw Adler delivering a package with a hidden bomb to a man Moriarty had used for a job, but the man's life and hers were saved by Sherlock. Moriarty figures out that she's protecting his arch-nemesis instead of helping him kill the man, so he eliminates her and taunts Sherlock into a game. Much of Moriarty's backstory is the same as the original Professor's. He was a child prodigy who studied at Cambridge and then parlayed it into a job as a mathematics professor. At some point, he turned to a life of crime, and the proof was the Jean Baptiste painting hanging in his office when Holmes first meets him. He deduced Moriarty's identity by observing a bit of chalk on his cuff when he followed Irene in disguise at the end of the first film, but experiencing his presence was quite different from seeing the man. One meeting was all it took to convince Holmes that this man was dangerous, and thus began a cat-and-mouse chase that ended at the Rheinbach Falls, only with much higher stakes. At the start of the film, Moriarty had acquired several businesses and institutions that, to the uninitiated, would seem unrelated. But upon closer inspection, a more enlightened mind would recall that all these organizations had one thing in common: they produced tools of war. During his time at Cambridge, Moriarty was part of an exclusive club that included the current Prime Minister of Britain. By mobilizing French Romani rebels, he helped to kickstart a world war, and the first domino had already fallen in the film. Moriarty had Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria assassinated to bring the world to the brink of war. In a castle in Switzerland, a peace summit was called to try and prevent the impending global catastrophe, where he would use one of his disguised assassins, given plastic surgery to make him indistinguishable from an ambassador, to create war instead. The Prime Minister was already in his pocket, so he would have no problem raising Britain's banners. With the companies he'd purchased, the war would make him one of the richest men in the world, and Moriarty got pretty damn close to achieving this goal too. Sherlock nearly died several times to unravel the true plot of his sinister enemy, and his intervention was just in time. The final sequence of the movie is phenomenal, where the two adversaries indulge in a chess game as they recount their plans to one another. Moriarty wasn't much bothered by Sherlock foiling his assassination attempt, because the damage had already been done. War was inevitable, and all Moriarty had to do was wait. Harris Moriarty was the embodiment of controlled chaos. He had so many strings moving in so many directions, that no matter how much an enemy caught up with him, he'd be safe as long as they didn't get too close. His arrogance was warranted, given that he managed to turn a brother against his sister, and forced the latter to take lethal measures just to save his life. He'd also murdered Sherlock's great love personally, so the satisfaction he took in that was disturbing to say the least. Jared Harris Moriarty had but one Achilles heel, and that was pride. At one point in the film, he personally tortured Holmes to get him to stop his pursuit. The endeavor left Sherlock gravely injured, but it also allowed him to swap out Moriarty's ledgers with fakes. He sent the originals back to London, where Lestrade managed to build up enough of a case around him to get a warrant for his arrest. Having been checkmated in game and in real life, Moriarty took matters into his own hands literally, and started wailing on Sherlock. The fact that Harris Moriarty was about a couple decades younger than his original counterpart and a trained boxer played into his favor. He had Sherlock cornered, and it was a far cry from his desperate attempt at murder-suicide from the final problem. But Robert Downey Jr.'s Holmes executed pretty much the exact same maneuver from that story. He didn't call it Baritsu, but he grabbed Moriarty and threw them both over the ledge. Jude Law's Watson was just in time to witness his best friend's demise, and it seemed like that was going to be that. And in the end of the film, as he leaves 221 Baker Street, we see that Sherlock is still alive, having survived his fall and disguised himself as his own sofa chair. It's probably best that we didn't get a third Downey film, seeing as this was the perfect moment to end things on. But Jared Harris Moriarty honestly stole the show from us. His cold, aristocratic portrayal of the character was completely faithful to how Arthur Conan Doyle had envisioned him, and his downfall was arguably better scripted. This is why it's kind of mind-blowing that around the same time, Andrew Scott was giving us a totally different version of the character. BBC's Sherlock updates Doyle's pantheon to fit the modern age, and gives us a Sherlock that uses a cell phone. Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman somehow end up giving us the most authentic depiction of Sherlock and Watson's friendship, in what some would call the most inauthentic setting for a Sherlock Holmes story. But it's a testament to the writing ability of Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss that Andrew Scott's Moriarty stole the show. When Sir Arthur created Moriarty, he basically thought of a character that could be a diametric opposite to Holmes, because that's the only thing that would make sense for his end. He makes an offhanded mention of the fact that many of their cases had Moriarty's invisible hand behind them, and that was that. Valley of Fear was the only story where the professor's presence was felt in person. But in BBC's Sherlock, Moriarty is there from the beginning, manipulating things from the shadows, toying with Sherlock, as he forces him into a confrontation. The first episode, A Study in Pink, features a cab driver who's using a game of Russian roulette to force victims to decide which pill to take. One pill was a placebo, and the other contained a lethal poison. He had killed 4 of his fares using this method, and Sherlock got himself captured because he wanted to prevent anyone else from becoming the 5th. He's saved at the end of the episode by his new roommate Watson, and before the cab driver died, he revealed that the man sponsoring his movements was Moriarty. Turns out he'd had a nasty falling out with his wife, and Moriarty cut him a deal whereby the more people he killed, the more money Moriarty would allocate to his children. He got up to 4, and this was only the beginning. In the second episode, Sherlock deals with a Chinese smuggling ring, whose sponsor is a mysterious man named M. When Holmes foils their plans, M has the ringleader sniped to death. In the season 1 finale, Sherlock Holmes meets James Moriarty for the first time, but he doesn't realize it. He visits lab technician Molly Harper, who's shown to have a crush on him since the beginning, and surmises that her new boyfriend Jim is actually gay. He also thinks IT Jim is hitting on him, when he's smacked in the face with the biggest case of his life. 5 victims need to be saved within a set time limit, according to a specific set of instructions, and all Sherlock can do is dance to the tune of the mysterious man called Moriarty. He barely manages to save most of them, but then Watson gets taken hostage. When Sherlock rendezvous with him, he sees that his friend has been rigged to blow, and Andrew Scott's Moriarty steps into the frame. For a man who had been depicted as being a spider that didn't move from its web and always played from the shadows, BBC gave its Moriarty quite a bit of agency. Sure, you can argue that Moriarty confronted Sherlock in the final problem as well, but not in this fashion, and certainly not with the psychopathy that Scott's Jim possesses. BBC Moriarty has been insane since he was a 13-year-old, when he systematically killed a kid called Carl Powers via poison and took his shoes as a trophy. Coincidentally, this was the case that drew Sherlock towards becoming a detective, because he wondered why a kid as meticulous as Powers would suddenly be missing a pair of shoes, whose laces he'd changed more times than he'd care to admit. Solving this case was part of the great game Moriarty forced Sherlock to play, and it wasn't the last one. The ending of Season 1 showed him poised to kill both Holmes and Watson, because they had become serious hindrances to his career. But the opening of Season 2 shows that he's been called off by Irene Adler. The first episode of the second season is an adaptation of A Scandal in Bohemia, and unlike that story, Irene is actually involved in blackmailing royalty in exchange for things of value. She's an exclusive dominatrix, and uses her profession to acquire insensitive photos of powerful individuals across the world, in service of one man, Moriarty. When Sherlock figures out her game at the end of the episode, she's taken to Pakistan, where Jim tries to have her killed by terrorists, but Sherlock saves her in the nick of time. The second episode is an adaptation of The Hound of the Baskervilles, so Moriarty isn't involved in it, but we do see him at the end of the episode being released after a conversation with Mycroft Holmes. In that season's finale, Moriarty hits the Bank of London, the Tower of London, and Pentonville Penitentiary at the same time, allowing himself to be captured. He manipulates the jury into letting him go, and as his final act, he decides to play the last great game with Holmes. Moriarty sends Sherlock on a wild goose chase, and sets up breadcrumbs that would make the world think the detective was crazy. He poses as the actor Richard Brooke, and fakes a psychotic break to force Sherlock into an isolated confrontation. When Sherlock finally agrees, Moriarty sends 3 assassins, not the same ones he used earlier in the series for Sherlock, after the people he cares for most: Lestrade, Mrs. Hudson, and John himself. He tells Sherlock that he knows the code word that would activate the fail-safe procedure that could save all three of their lives, but all he had to do was jump off the roof of the building they were standing on. Sherlock read Moriarty's bluff and called out his obsession with him, and in a way, he was right. Scott Moriarty is the most unhinged version of the character, and we don't mean that in a cute way. When he suspected Irene Adler of double-crossing him, he had no problem threatening to strip the skin off her bones. He tells Sherlock that life is usually boring, and that dying is what people do, but he finds him interesting. Their game has been the most fun he's had in a while, but now that it was ending, he realized that Sherlock was too ordinary. Holmes predicted that he could likely torture the code word out of Moriarty, so he threatened to do just that, and this made Jim ecstatic. He acknowledged that the two of them shared one thing apart from their intellect, and that was darkness. He was thrilled that Sherlock was ready to take his life in the most painful way imaginable if that's what it took, so he beat him to it. Andrew Scott's Moriarty pulled out a gun and shot himself in the skull, and forced Benedict's Holmes to jump off St. Bartholomew Hospital's terrace, which served as BBC's version of Reichenbach. To be fair, they did a better job of selling Holmes' death than Arthur Conan Doyle did, seeing as his body went kaplat in the middle of a street. Moriarty killed himself instead of falling to the tide, and in the first episode of Season 3, it was revealed that Sherlock used an elaborate group effort to ensure his survival, while simultaneously making himself appear dead. With Moriarty gone, it was going to be much harder to track his network down and deliver them to justice, so Holmes retreated to the shadows and worked with only his irregulars for 2 years. He revealed himself to Watson while he was on a date with his girlfriend Mary, which ticked him off proper, but the two friends were able to reconcile in the end. Moriarty's influence was missing from Season 3 for the most part, save for a few flashbacks and Mind Palace scenes. But it resurfaced at the end when every single public screen in London suddenly started transmitting a video of him, claiming that he was back. Sherlock was about to be sent on a suicide mission by the British government for killing Charles Augustus Magnuson in front of their agents. But when Moriarty returned, they cancelled all that in an instant. Season 4 ended up making Sherlock's sister and the third Holmes sibling, Eurus, the ultimate villain of the franchise. And turns out, she was crazier than Jim. Eurus had been institutionalized at an early age because, like her brothers, she too was a genius. But unlike them, she applied her genius to commit evil acts, so she needed to be kept under psychiatric monitoring. However, Eurus ended up turning every person in her facility to her side, and used her bargaining chip as Mycroft's sister to get him to give her 5 minutes with Jim. This request was made before his demise, and the Miss Me messages were basically it. Eurus wanted to destroy her brother physically, emotionally, and mentally for abandoning her as a child, and what better way to do that than to use his greatest enemy's face? Once Sherlock dealt with his sister, his name was truly cleared of the wrongdoings that Moriarty had accused him of in the past. He got the closest thing to a happy ending since the John Barrymore films, and Andrew Scott's turn as Moriarty became the stuff of legend. He took Doyle's greatest villain and flipped it on its head to show us how detached from reality Moriarty could easily have become. Doyle's Moriarty was of excellent birth and education, an actual professor, and a man who hid in the shadows to conduct all his shady dealings. Even if he ordered someone to assassinate you, you wouldn't know about his involvement unless you were on the level of Sherlock Holmes. Now, yes, one can make the argument that being in the digital age posed significant challenges to the kind of anonymity Doyle's Moriarty could maintain. But Scott's Jim also showed how big of a crutch relying on technology could be. In his final confrontation with Sherlock, he revealed that he made up the idea that there was some sort of secret binary code that allowed him to disable security at all 3 locations simultaneously, because he knew Holmes would snap at the bait. Sherlock's mind needed everything to be a complex puzzle, and this was why he was going to finally lose to Moriarty. Of course, he won in the end, but Jim's ghost haunted him till the end. Moriarty is represented as a straight-jacketed lunatic in Sherlock Holmes' Mind Palace, but that isn't the case for the original professor. He was a strong, cultured, disciplined man, and we can't imagine him wearing his underwear a bit too provocatively just to throw Holmes off his game. So yes, in many ways, Andrew Scott's Moriarty is his own character. He does things that appear sloppy. He does things that end up incriminating him directly. He feels like the textbook insane kid that grows up to be an evil genius, but he's also so damn compelling. Every moment he appears on screen, he's swallowing the other characters' auras with his own. He breathed life back into a character that was getting way too overdone. Till this day, people think of his Moriarty as being right up there with Porter and Olivier's, but he isn't the last version of the professor.
Thanks to a new member of our student body, Molly Hardy.
The female Moriartys. In the era of diversity, we would be remiss not to mention the litany of women who have taken up the mantle of the evil genius. The first woman to become Moriarty, in essence if not name, was Sarah Easer. She played Molly Hardy, the foil to Sherlock Holmes' great-grandniece Shirley Holmes, who'd been created by YTV in the late 90s. Given that this was a children's mystery show, Molly Hardy's nefarious plans included becoming student president by manipulating students, teachers, and the vote. But she was a confirmed sociopath with an IQ of 160, descended straight from Professor Moriarty's line, so she might as well been his reincarnation in teenage witch form. The latest female portrayal of the Professor comes from 2022's Enola Holmes sequel, with Sharon Duncan Brewster stepping in for the role. Throughout the movie, she poses as Mina Troy, secretary to Lord McIntyre, the royal treasurer. Enola Holmes 2 focuses on the matchstick strikes from the late 19th century, so it's from within that lens that the story is told. A young girl called Edith comes to Enola to ask for help in locating her missing friend, Sarah Chapman. Sarah Chapman was a real-life member of the matchstick strike, so it's always good to see real history being incorporated in fictional stories. While investigating her disappearance, Enola realizes that a mysterious disease is running throughout the matchstick factories of Britain, and that leads her to Lord McIntyre, who was covering up the whole thing for greater profits. He was telling the workers that they were suffering from typhus, when in fact it was white phosphorus poisoning. In the end, Enola and Sherlock apprehend Lord McIntyre and the true mastermind behind his scheme, Mina Troy, aka Moriarty. Though McIntyre is arrested and successfully imprisoned, Moriarty escapes, and we suspect we will see Sharon reprise the role in a future Enola Holmes film, considering the fact that Millie Bobby Brown plays her character. But that brings us to the most significant female adaptation of Professor Moriarty, which comes courtesy of Elementary. In this CBS hit, Moriarty's character is merged with Irene Adler's, and given a full-fledged relationship with Holmes, which ends with him spiraling into his drug habit. Elementary tells us that Holmes first met her at her house in London, where she posed as a Renaissance restorationist. He remarked that one of her paintings was stolen. She said something to the effect of, "What's a girl to do?" and thus a relationship was born. Sherlock and Irene dated for several months, and though he usually treats women as nothing more than outlets for his physical desires, Elementary Sherlock truly loved Irene, so much so that he found it difficult focusing on her and Moriarty, who'd fallen on his radar by then. Knowing that she couldn't hide the truth from him forever, and that this would end with one of them dying, Irene decided to fake her death and continue her criminal empire as Moriarty. Sherlock was devastated when he found her corpse in her burned-down home, and he immediately connected it to Moriarty, though he had no idea just who the person he pursued truly was. Holmes spiraled into heroin addiction after losing Irene, and had to move to New York of all places to get away from her memory. But soon enough, Joan Watson found the letters he'd exchanged with Irene, and that forced him to burn her out of his life, literally. The last person he was expecting to find while investigating a case related to Moriarty was his long-dead girlfriend, the reason behind his overdose. But there she was. Holmes was overcome with emotion at first, because he was just so happy to see the love of his life still alive. Irene told him she'd been a captive of Moriarty's for a long time, and she'd been acting like she was slowly losing her mind. But when Holmes discovered that she'd had a mole that used to be on her back surgically removed, he realized she was Moriarty. It broke him to admit that he'd been sleeping with the enemy all this time, and that the only reason he was alive and unharmed was because of her order of protection. But nonetheless, justice was Holmes' true first love. With Watson's help, he concocted a plan to engineer an overdose, knowing Moriarty wouldn't be able to resist gloating while she offered Sherlock help. Jamie would often say that he solves puzzles and she plays games, and that he was a game she'd win every time. But on this occasion, she'd been outplayed. Sherlock and Watson recorded her confession to coercing a Greek government official into becoming her cat's paw. And with that, Moriarty's personal reign of terror ended, at least for the time being. Sherlock's power broker dad, Morland, took control of her organization and got to work on dismantling it from the inside, while Sherlock himself kept in touch with her through letters. During her entire time in a black site prison, Moriarty was known to have escaped custody twice. The first time was when she learned that a former lieutenant of hers had kidnapped her biological daughter. He took life-threatening injuries trying to get her out of bonds, but she killed no guards during her escape, and she promptly returned to prison once she'd guaranteed her daughter's safety. In the series finale of Elementary, a series of events unfolds that makes Sherlock think Moriarty has escaped, but he dismisses the idea. But series creator Robert Doherty revealed that Jamie was in fact still alive after the finale, which leaves the entire tale of the Elementary verse wide open. Gender swapping his greatest enemy and merging him with the one woman he respected was certainly a risky reinterpretation, but the intimacy between Natalie Dormer and Johnny Lee Miller's characters made it work. By layering Moriarty into his personal life in such a vulnerable way, the showrunners were able to show the consequences of an unstable man creating unstable attachments perfectly, in our opinion. The fact that Sherlock, despite being a master detective, couldn't tell that the woman he was sleeping with was the man he was chasing. But such is the madness of love, eh? Most modern Sherlocks are romantics at heart, and we're sure the one from Watson used to be one too. But that was 6 months before the series even began, and so far it doesn't look like he's coming back. Natalie's Jamie Moriarty was the closest to being the one that got away, seeing as her ultimate fate was left rather vague. The same won't be the case for Randall Park, whose Moriarty has technically already won the war. CBS's second major outing with the franchise, Watson, shows us what happens half a year after the Reichenbach Falls incident, and turns John into a major part of the story. In Doyle's original original work, Watson only realizes that Holmes and Moriarty fell over once he reaches the hotel where he'd been called to for a medical emergency, only to find out that there was no emergency. It's only in later interpretations that John starts showing up when Sherlock is about to die. In BBC's Sherlock, Watson reaches the street that Holmes jumps onto right as he does the deed. In Game of Shadows, Jude Law rushes out to the balcony where Downey Jr. and Jared Harris were delivering a masterclass in faux chess, only to end up being too late. In Watson, Morris Chestnut dives in after Holmes and Moriarty like Nathan Drake, and ends up paying for it by getting bonked on his head so hard, his brain now resembles scrambled eggs. Watson is struggling to keep his act together, and at the same time, he's being betrayed by the one man he thinks of as his friend. The ending of episode 1 revealed that Shinwell Johnson, who started off as Watson's appointed aide according to Sherlock's will, was actually an agent of Professor Moriarty. Randall Park's version of the character is a suburban Pittsburgh dad, with the kind of smile that the everyday man could never suspect of wrongdoing. But seen within context, it's actually enough to give you the chills. Park's Moriarty works with a tech company that's most likely invested in drones or spyware, because it's called Always Everywhere. He's making Stillwell steal genetic samples from Watson's Holmes clinic, because he has plans to continue Andrew Scott's legacy of anarchy. Craig Sweeney, the creator of the show, has stated that Park's version of Moriarty doesn't exactly have long-term plans. He's more of a cause chaos and adapt to the fallout kind of guy. In that regard, he's a lot like Joker, and will admit that over the years there's been a lot of overlap between the two dynamic detective duos. But the difference here is that Bruce Wayne is dead, and Robin has the run of the show with a brain injury that's being made worse by the wrong medication. That's right, folks. Moriarty has thought far enough ahead to make Shinwell put Watson on the wrong medicines, so that even if he can't take the man out, the pills will, and the only man that will end up in the crossfire is someone he has leverage on. Park's Moriarty is honestly the only thing that can save Watson from the House 2.0 accusations, because without him, that's pretty much what the show is. Though we might find many elements of Watson questionable, we still can't wait to see this professor's backstory, and how it adds to the wider lore of the Moriarty character, because marvelous verdict. That's all we got for you in this video, guys. Now we know there's probably scores of Professor Moriarty variants that we haven't even mentioned here, but what we wanted to do was give you guys a major character study that touched upon the biggest milestone moments of his life. From Gustav von Zeffertitz to Sharon Duncan Brewster, the lore of the evil math genius turned covert warlord has taken on layer after layer of depth, and in this video, we attempted to peel them back. We hope you guys liked it, and even if you didn't, or if we missed your favorite Moriarty, let us have it either way in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep your magnifying glasses out of the sun, because that's a fire hazard, my dudes.